Good afternoon, everyone. This is the session of the Royal Economic Society Women's Committee. Today, we're going to be talking about the efficient allocation of female talent in economics. What are the cultural and institutional factors? We have a great lineup of speakers that I will be introducing shortly. My name is Almudena Sevilla, and I am a professor of economics at UCL. I am also the chair of the Women's Committee at the Royal Economic Society. So this session, what we want to convey is first, we want to show the lack of female representation in economics and in the persistence of this underrepresentation of female talent in the economics profession. And then we want to understand the reasons. So some of the papers that we're going to hear today will try to look at several factors that may be behind this lack of representation. And we'll end up with a presentation from Shelly Lambert, talking about the consequences of this lack of representation for the production of economics knowledge. So I think we have a great session today. And I'm not going to take up more time. I'm going to let the first speaker talk. The first speaker is Erin Hengel. She is a member of the Women's Committee and also the author of the report about the gender imbalance in the economics, in the UK economics profession. And she's going to give us some numbers about we start. So over to you, Erin.
Thank you, Almudena. Yeah, so like Almudena said, I'm here to present the latest gender report. So I don't know if some of you are familiar with this, but effectively, one of the key roles of the Royal Economic Society's Women Committee is to monitor the position of female economists within the UK. And we've basically been doing that since 1996 when the Women's Committee began. And we've been doing that by collecting data on the representation of women in economics departments in the UK, and also writing reports on that, generally at least annually. So previous reports actually used a questionnaire that was distributed by the Royal Economic Society itself to the heads of departments. Later years, this was supplemented by data from websites. But in this latest report in 2021, for the very first time, we used administrative data from the UK Higher Education Statistical Agency. Now, all staff in UK universities are required, or all universities are required to report every year on the contractual and demographic makeup of their staff and students. Now, there are some limitations with the HESA data compared to the previous RES survey data. For example, it's much harder to be able to identify the people who are actually specifically engaged in teaching and research in economics. But there are also a lot of benefits. So you get a lot more granular data on the composition of staff. And it also allows us to analyze both students and staff members, and also look at ethnicity. So this first graphic shows the percentage of women among permanent full-time staff members in economics who are on kind of a standard contract of employment at a UK university. The dotted lines are the original Royal Economic Society survey data. And then the solid lines starting in about 2012, those are the data we have from HESA. Now, the HESA data and the RES survey data they don't perfectly overlap. This is because there were very important differences in the universities that were included in the HESA data and included in the RES survey data. There were also differences in how different categories of staff were actually determined within. But nevertheless, the overlap is pretty strong. And it suggests, that basically the HESA data fairly closely tracks the Royal Economic Society's own survey data. Now, what does this graphic suggest? So, I mean, it shows that we've been seeing some progress, and there's definitely been progress that has been made, and an increasing share of women in economics faculties. But it does also show that, especially since 2012, growth has stalled to some extent. And in fact, in 2018, women still only represented about 26% of overall academic staff members on a normal academic contract, which was not radically different from the number that they represented in 2012. So this is now a breakdown of staff members by their employment function. So if you're not familiar with the UK education system, basically there are three types of contracts. So there's this research-only contract, and these tend to be almost entirely short-term, fixed-term, non-permanent posts, largely for postdoctoral researchers, as well as for people who are working in someone else's lab. So we don't include that here. We're really interested in permanent posts. And we see here, amongst those permanent posts, there are the teaching-only posts, and then the more traditional posts, which combine responsibilities for both teaching and research. And we see that most permanent positions, or basically when we look at this graph, we see that women are making, they're making quite a bit of progress in teaching-only positions, which is the dotted line. So between 2012 and 2018, the proportion of women among these contracts increased about 6 percentage points, but they have made a lot less progress on increases in the more traditional positions with both teaching and research responsibilities. So over that exact same period, the growth of women amongst academic staff members has only increased by about 4 percentage points. So here, we break it down by the representation of women by academic rank as well as ethnicity. So we find that in 2018, only about 8% of standard academic posts in economics were held by minority women. And for comparison, that's 17% of academic posts are held by minority men. And this really, and this is kind of concerning, this really doesn't appear to be changing very much over time. And one thing that I think we find particularly concerning is the fact that the percentage of Asian professors who are women has actually declined 6 percentage points between 2012 and 2018. And this decline is actually especially stark among economists from Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi origins. Another aspect that is worth pointing out is that at no point actually between 2012 and 2018 was a Black female professor of economics actually employed anywhere in the UK. This is actually a bigger issue. It's not something that's specific to economics, the lack of Black professors, and it's gotten a lot of media attention in the UK. But we still nevertheless find that a figure of 0 to be particularly concerning, saying that economics has to grapple with. And it's especially considering that the numbers of Black female students that we teach is not 0. So now we're going to break it down by students. So here what we have are students. We have it broken down by whether they're studying economics as a first degree, which is a solid black line, at the master's level or at the doctorate level, and it shows the percentage of women. Women are more common among postgraduate students than they are actually among economics undergraduate students, and they are especially common among master's students, where the ratio of female students is actually over 50%. But amongst undergraduates, it's actually only 32%. And amongst PhD students, it hovers around 40. Now, why is that? This is largely an artifact of, so basically the fact that women are more likely to study at the master's and the PhD level is thanks to an influx of non-UK students who are coming to the UK to study economics at the postgraduate level. So here we've basically broken down the representation of women by whether the students are from the UK, the EU, or a non-EU country, and not the UK. So we see basically the representation of women is actually much higher among foreign students, and it's very low actually among UK nationals. And in fact, our data suggests that this gender gap among UK nationals has actually gotten worse and not better since 2002, especially at the undergraduate level. So I think the percentage of UK domiciled students who are undergraduates and women has actually fallen from 31% in 2002 to 27% in 2018. So just kind of to quickly summarize, and I'll move on because I know we have a busy schedule. This is just a quick summary of the stuff that we have in the report, and I encourage you to take a look at it. But we find basically that there has been progress. There's progress that has been made in the representation of women among UK academic economists since 1996. Now, having said that, women are still underrepresented, especially among staff economists. And I mean, kind of to put that in perspective, you could say that like women amongst economic students is in fact 36%, whereas women amongst economic staff members on a normal contract is only 26%. So there's a gap of about 10 percentage points. It also appears that the progress and the representation of women in the economics profession and in staff has started to stall, and that started around 2012, and that's especially in the professorial and in the lecturer level. And amongst students, we also really want to draw special attention to the underrepresentation of women amongst UK nationals. Now, there have been many different initiatives that have begun to kind of tackle this issue. And I think Sarah's going to talk about Discover Economics later, and this is great. And we really hope that we can, this kind of momentum can continue on in the future. So basically, to conclude, again, we should be proud of the progress that we've made in increasing the representation of women, but also recognize that there is still work to be done. Okay.
Thank you, Erin. Right on time. Actually, you have 3 minutes still left, but that's okay, because I forgot to say, so each presenter is going to be talking for 15 minutes, and we're going to leave the questions, which I hope are a lot, from the audience at the end of this session. But do feel free for those of you out there, we can't see you, but I hope that you start writing your questions in the chat, and I'll be keeping track of those and ask them to our speakers at the end of the session. We'll allow for 15 minutes for questions and answers. But please do write your questions as we go. So our next presenter is Alessandra Casarico from Bocconi University. And Alessandra is going to talk about the gender advising practices at entry level in the profession. So over to you, Alessandra.
So thank you very much. I hope you can see my slides and hear me. I'm really glad to be here participating to this session. So thank you, Almudena, for inviting me. And I'm presenting joint work with Audinga Baltrunaite and Lucia Rizzica, both at the Bank of Italy. So I think that the introduction by Erin already, let's say, gave us some help in introducing the topic. So we know that the underrepresentation of women in academic ranks is an important issue. It's a widespread phenomenon. It's strong especially in some fields, and probably economics is among them. And it is visible, especially at higher positions, so the so-called phenomenon of the leaky pipeline. And there has been some progress, but this progress is not perhaps as wide as we would like it to be. So in this paper, we focus on the transition from graduate program to work, and we try to explore the influence of advising practices, and let me call it the referral process or the refereeing process on career outcomes. And we do so by building a data set on a large sample of job market candidates and referees or letter writers. We study the content and the style of reference letters to try and unveil gender stereotypes which are conveyed through language. And then we try to track candidates to their career outcome and study how these outcomes correlate with how candidates are talked about in their reference letters by their advisors. The papers, I don't have a lot of time to go through the literature, but I mean, I think it is at the intersection between the economic literature, which has started a few years back to study the roots of the leaky pipeline in the economics profession, both focusing on, say, differences in observable, but also trying to understand the role that implicit gender bias and stereotypes may have in hindering female careers. And the other literature which is relevant for what we try to do is that in the applied psychology or linguistic, which has tried to study which I studied, the implicit gender bias in reference processes by trying to analyze the letters for female candidates and for male candidates, and unveiling that those for female candidates tend to put more emphasis on interpersonal skills and personality characteristics and less emphasis on ability characteristics. So our contribution is that of investigating the transition from graduate program to work and assess one of its key institutions, so the referral process. We try to combine different disciplines by applying modern text analysis tools on a large corpus of documents to study language as a vehicle for stereotypes. And then we incorporate these measures of gender bias in language in a regression analysis framework where we account for differences in observable characteristics to evaluate which influence they have on career outcomes. So a few more words on the data. So we build these data sets, which contains information about job market application packages to 3 departments at 2 top institutions hiring in the international job market. And I guess that by looking at the authors, you can guess which institution they are. For 2 departments, we have 10 years of data, and for one of them, we have 5 years of data. Overall, we have approximately 8,000 candidates, 800 of which have applied to more than 1 department. So basically, we drop them when we conduct the analysis. And in terms of referees, we have approximately 8,500 letter writers, sponsors, advisors, referees. I will use these words to give the same meaning or to refer to the same thing. We classify candidates and referees by gender using the names libraries. We have information about the pre-job market career, taking it from candidate CVs. And then we collect all reference letters. We have approximately 25,000 reference letters. And the last part of the construction of the data set has to do with the collection of information on career outcomes. And we do this by scraping LinkedIn, Google Scholar, and REPEC. And we are able at the moment to track about 94% of the candidates. And last, we match the academic institution, both say the origin institution, meaning the one where you had your PhD, and the destination, the one you moved to, with the QS ranking and REPEC ranking in order to have an indicator of the prestige of the institution you come from and you move to. So just some descriptives on the data. So here you can see the gender composition of applicants and of letter writers, and you can clearly see that both female candidates and academics are a minority, and the more so when you focus on, let's say, referees, so letter writers compared to candidates. And the other thing which we can see from this graph is that there doesn't seem to be, let's say, a great improvement over time. Some more detail on the job market candidates by looking at their pre-job market characteristics. What you can see is that, I mean, you look here at male, female, and the difference in these different observable characteristics that we have related to the pre-job market. You can see that female candidates are more likely to have EU PhDs. They tend to come, you see it here, from lower ranked institution. If you, let's say, accept that we can use this top 20 QS and top 20 REPEC Econ as indicators of the prestige of the institution, and they also have fewer pre-job market applications, pre-job market publications, sorry. Another observation, which also comes from other papers, is that there is a significant difference or gender difference in terms of field of research, and female candidates seems to be more focusing on applied micro compared to macro international finance or theory and quantitative, where you see more male candidates concentrate on. And we think that this is a representative sample of the European job market. We try to somehow benchmark our data to the one of the European job market candidate directory. And what you see in terms of number, remember that we have approximately 10 years. And in terms of overall characteristics, in terms of fields candidates focus on, or in terms of their, let's say, the PhD institution they come from, they are quite in line with what we have in our data set. Then we also have information about the reference letters. And what you can observe here is that women have fewer letters. So male candidates have more letter than female ones. Female candidates are more likely to have female advisors writing their letters and are also more likely to have a female academic as a main advisor. And they also receive letters which are shorter in length. And in terms of outcomes, I go very quickly here, but what you see is that, I mean, with the different measures of outcome, which have to do with whether you had an academic placement, where you place in terms of institution of destination, whether you are associate or the number of publication, and whether you have a top 5 or a top 3 finance publication, and the number of citation, it seems that women are faring worse compared to male candidates. This is the descriptives related to the referees, and this is something we are still working on. And you can observe by looking at these statistics that female advisors write fewer letters compared to male advisors. They are more often for female students, and this is in line with what we saw before with reference to candidates, and they are somehow less experienced and with the lower academic achievement. And I mean, this would be also related to the fact that they are basically younger compared to male candidates. So quickly on to the text analysis that we do on reference letters. So first of all, we need to build our corpus, and we follow, let's say, the standard steps in order to do so. And we have to exclude the letters which were written in Italian, and we end up with approximately 19,000 documents and 83,000 unique lemmas, which represent our corpus. So what do we do with this corpus of letter? What we are after, or what we would like to understand, is what advisors, letter writers write, or what do they say about their candidates. And in order to get to this, we resort to a supervised approach, which is word embedding. But we draw also from the applied psychology literature I was referring before, which has identified, let's say, group of words which refer to standout, grindstone, communal, or agentive characteristic with which candidate can be described. And we want to see whether in the description of each female or male candidate, advisors resort to this word differently for men and women. So basically what we want to do is to capture the meaning similarity or between words, or their general relatedness in semantic terms. So in order to do this, we cannot consider each word in isolation, but as we write here, you shall know, or we shall know, a word by the company it keeps. So we need to look at words in a context. And what we do is just to take each target word, think about the standout, the grindstone, or the agentic and communal adjective I was referring to before. We transform them into a vector. So all words are transformed into vector, and the position of these vectors and the relative proximity to other words or vector is the way in which we can capture the semantic similarity between words. And in particular, similarity is defined through the cosine distance. And the idea is that word vectors with the smaller angles denote or represent words which are more similar to one another. And this cosine similarity can move between -1 and 1. And when you have positive values of this cosine similarity, it means that words are more related to each other. So we try to explore basically whether female and male candidates are described using words which are more standout, grindstone, communal, or agentic. And so in this table, you see this measure, the cosine similarity I talked about very briefly before. And I'm looking at the cosine similarity between personality traits and candidate by candidate gender. And here I'm simply taking the difference between the cosine similarity, and you notice that female candidates are described more often in terms of grindstone and agentic and less in terms of standout words. And this holds also when we calculate conditional differences, where conditional differences are take also into account the year of application, the department to which the applicant sent his or her application, the field of research, and the PhD institution. Now I try to do the same thing, that is calculating the cosine similarity by looking at the referee gender, okay? So I just consider male referees and female referees, trying to understand whether it is male or female referees who talk more about or who use more standout Grindstone communal or agentic words. And what you find is that, what we find at the moment is that female letter writers tend to emphasize candidate personal traits more compared to male letter writers, irrespective of the gender of the candidate. However, when we try to combine the gender of the candidate, the gender of the referee together, what you see is that you find, let's say, significant differences only when you focus on male referees. And it is male referees who tend to use more gendered language compared to what happened with female referees, who, on the contrary, seem not to use any type of gender language when talking about female or male candidates. Now onto the, let's say, how we use this information into our regression setting. Now here, you need to define what success is. We have different definition. I'm going to focus only on the first one, which is assume that a candidate end up in a department which is top 20 and at the same time is associate professor. Then we also look at, say, whether you are or not an associate, irrespective of the ranking of the institution, whether you are in a top institution, irrespective of where you are placed in the ladder. And basically, we run regressions where we have a female dummy, we take into account all the candidate characteristics that we can observe, all the characteristics of the letter writers, the characteristics of the letters, and then we include this word embedding, grindstone, and standout to see whether also what you talk about in the letter has any influence on career outcomes. And this is what we find. So the first column is just a row gender gap, where we only control for year fixed effect. The second column is the same regression, but it's just performed only on the observation for which we can observe all the characteristics on the letters. In the third column, we include candidate characteristics. And candidate characteristics, besides the number of publication pre-job market, have to do again with the university they did their PhD, the field of research they were in, the department to which they made application. And we see that indeed individual characteristics or candidate characteristics are important in influencing, let's say, the row gender gap. But the same holds also when you look at the characteristics of the advisor. They also contribute to explaining the row gender gap. The characteristics of the letter that candidate received, whether they were short or long, and also the content in terms of what these letters say. And what you could notice here is that standout adjective somehow, or the standout cosine similarity helps in your career, whereas the grindstone do not. And remember that women are more frequently described with the grindstone adjective or grindstone words compared to standout words. I don't know how I'm faring with the time. I guess I'm almost done. The other regression I wanted to show you had to do with research output. And here I'm just report results related to whether you have a publication in the top 8 or not. So top 5 economics plus top 3 of finance. And you see that female candidates are still at a disadvantage. And again, it's candidate characteristics which contribute the most to the explanation of this row gender gap. But it is still the case that the characteristics related to letters are important, and so are the length of the letter and the number of letter writers you had, or the advisor characteristics. So it was a bit of a rush, but just to conclude, so the job market is a key step in the academic career, and it seems, according to what we are studying, that the referral process is not neutral. Female candidates receive different support relative to males, both quantitatively, they receive fewer letters, and qualitatively, there is more emphasis on personality rather than professional traits. The use of gender language seems, however, to be mainly driven by male letter writers. And taking into account these characteristics related to the letters somehow reduces or contributes or influences the observed gender gaps in early career outcomes. This is still, we are still working on it. And in particular, we are trying to retrieve also the information on first placement, which is particularly relevant for, let's say, older applicant, because when we were looking at the placement, we were looking at the current placement. And here we are trying, let's say, to track the entire story for those who have applied in earlier years. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope I was clear enough, and I look forward to your questions at the end of the session. Thank you, Almudena.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. It's really interesting. I love the data that you have, and I have already many questions, but I wait for the end of the session. So our next speaker is Nagore Idiberry from University of the Basque Country, and she's going to talk about the differences in peer recognition in economics, the gender differences. So Nagore, off you go. Thanks.
Thank you very much for being able to contribute this piece to this session, which is absolutely relevant and important. So I'm gonna be, actually, I think it's a great complement to the previous piece of paper, because at the end of the day, we are going to be focusing on a slightly different time in the career, not in the beginning, but something that comes much, much later. So let me just describe the type of peer recognition we are going to be talking about. So it's a type of peer recognition that is coming from very known and relevant institutions within the profession of academia in economics. So one of the oldest institutions is the Econometric Society, that has been acknowledging since 1933 every year Econometric Society fellows. So this project was inspired by the Econometric Society, but then we realized that there are other institutions that do similar acknowledgement and recognitions. And what we thought was, well, given the patterns of gender would we observe over the past century, say, well, is this something happening only in the Econometric Society, or is this something happening more broadly in the profession? So we are going to also be looking at the American Economic Association. They acknowledge, distinguish, or they appoint distinguished fellows every year since 1965. And then there are two institutions in academia, not only for econ, but also for other fields, that every year they appoint members. One is the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the other one is National Academy of Sciences. And in the last part of the presentation, I'm going to move to looking at how female scholars' contributions have been treated in these other institutions as well. So let me start just showing you what is the share of females in all these peer recognitions, in this type of acknowledgement. And this graph is pretty representative in the sense that starts in 1933, because this is when the Econometric Society started appointing these fellows. And so something that we can clearly see is that before the 80s, pretty much this share of females was almost non-existent. Then it has been below 10%. And clearly, another thing that draws probably your attention is that in the last decade, especially since 2012 on, there has been a large increase in all these institutions regarding the female share among the fellows, okay, among the appointed or recognized people. So the question that we are going to address in this project is basically two of them. The first one is, well, what happened in these old times? Was it the case that the female share that deserved to be acknowledged was indeed so low, or basically non-existent, or was there indeed people and female scholars that were contributing quite a lot to this academic profession in economics, but they were basically ignored, okay? And the second thing that we are going to try to explain is what explains this huge increase or sharp increase in the female representation among these fellows. Okay, so these are going to be the two main questions we are going to be addressing. As the project was inspired by the Econometric Society, the main focus has been in the project on the Econometric Society, but as I mentioned, we also look at other institutions because we wanted to see whether this was something specific to the Econometric Society or something going on more broadly in the profession. So let me say something about the data constructions because it was labor intensive, and also part of this data is going to be publicly shared. So maybe you might think of other projects that you can do with this data set. So a small part of this project is quickly or easily obtained, which is everyone who has been appointed for being an Econometric Society fellow or fellow in the other institutions. It's all very accessible in the sense that if you go to this institution, very easy to get who has been appointed for all these years and for every year. So this part of the data is easy to get. Now, when you think of who was at the risk of obtaining this type of acknowledgements and recognitions, this is a little bit trickier. So we basically had to construct this data set that we call active researchers. And here the key question was, who was at the risk of obtaining this type of recognitions? So we do these constructions of data set ending with about 40,000 active researchers from over the past century, starting early 1900 and 2019. So how do we do that? The process there is pretty simple. So you basically collected or identified the key journals in the profession in economics. We ended up with 36 economic journals. We go to every journal, we download every paper that this journal published since the start of the journal until 2019. We do some cleaning of these papers. Basically, you get rid of comments, replies, short papers that are not really research papers, and we end up with a big set of paper level data set. Then we try to do basically reshape this data set and end up having for each unique author all the papers that this author has published in this set of 36 journals. Okay, so at the end of the day, it's kind of constructing CVs for every author that appears at least once in this data set. And so we basically have, so you are going, any author is going to be in this data set if this author has published at least once in any of these 36 journals since 1900 until 2019. And then we keep track of the same author if this person has been publishing more journals in these 36 journals, okay? Also for the top 5 journals, we downloaded the citations that each paper has been accumulating since the paper was published until 2019, okay? So this is kind of constructions of a CV for each author that appears at least once in this data set. And what we are trying to say was, well, given we have this panel for each author, we know who got elected at this particular year in for being an Econometric Society fellow and who didn't get elected, okay? So what we are going to try to do is see whether gender, female, has any significantly different treatment in the recognition of their contributions or in the selection of being a fellow, okay? So let me show you the main results. So given we are going to be looking at almost a century of data, we are going to divide in 3 different time periods: before the 80s and the 90s, and then the 2000 and the 2019. Every year we have year fixed effects. And our main controls for production, for contributions, are going to be the publications in the 36 journals for a particular year and author, and also the sites in the publications in the articles that have been published in the top 5 journals. Okay, so this is the main result table that we find. So what do we find? I'm only showing you the female coefficient, of course, the production and the published articles are highly determinant of your probability of getting elected or selected for econometric society fellows. But here we are going to focus on the female coefficient. So what we find is here I'm showing you two different specifications. Let's take the most complete one, or the one that we believe that is the most complete one, which is the second column. So what we find is that in the old times, indeed, females had a lower likelihood controlling for their scientific contributions in terms of papers and in terms of sites. We do find that female authors had a lower likelihood of being recognized or being selected for Econometric Society Fellow. In the 80s and in the 90s, we do not find any hard evidence that female indeed or the gender had a different treatment, okay? And what we also find is that especially for the most recent period, 2010 on, the last decade, the female coefficient now has changed, it's becoming positive, and it's again significant. So meaning that nowadays, controlling for their CV or their scientific contributions, now women have a higher likelihood of being elected compared to men, okay? Let me show you briefly these results graphically. So this is a very similar female share that I showed you before, but now I start in 1960, okay? Then we can also draw the female share among the active researchers, okay? So basically in the profession, and this, the female share is not that far away from the one that we saw in the UK. It's slightly lower, but it's a little bit above 20%. Now, of course, this doesn't tell us much about whether they should have gotten these fellowships or they didn't. So what we are going to add in here are two more lines, especially the blue and the green, which are the female share among those who have at least 3 top 5s or at least 1 econometrica and 1 review or 1 review of economic studies, okay? Now, having these shares and being compared with the female share among the elected Econometric Society fellows, we find exactly the same story that I already told you in the regression. So before the 80s, the female share among those who had at least 3 top 5 is definitely above the female share in the elected fellows. So there were some women who actually went ignored. In the 80s, in the 90s, this is all a little bit messed up. So it's not clear whether gender had a differential treatment. And clearly in the last decade, the female share among the Econometric Society fellows is definitely above the female share among those who have at least 3 5s. Okay, so we do see a very different evolution of the female coefficient over the past century when looking at whether men and women indeed have a different or equal likelihood of getting elected, always controlling for their scientific contributions. Don't have much time to get into the details of how we can explain this, but something that we do in the paper is we got data from the Econometric Society on the nominated people, because in case you don't know, in order to be elected as Econometric Society fellow, you first have to be nominated. And there are 2 sources of nomination. You can be nominated by somebody who is already a fellow, or you can be nominated by the fellow nominating committee, especially since 1995. And let me just tell you the results. So what we do find is that indeed this fellow nominating committee had a big influence in bringing in women into the nominees, okay? Not that much the existing fellows, but yes, the fellow nominating committee. And this is not a coincidence. Indeed, the fellow nominating committee was mandated, was asked or requested to include females among the nominees, okay, along with other dimensions. For example, they were also requested to add people from not only theory, but basically looking for diversity in terms of topics or fields, and also diversity in terms of regions, okay? So when female diversity was, or gender diversity was indeed added to this mandate, they brought in big names and very prominent women, and they were now appointed, okay? So just to finish, I wanted to say, well, is this something specific to the econometric society, or is this something that we can also see in other institutions that acknowledge or provide or appoint a similar type of rewards? And here, what we are going to do is looking at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and National Academy of Sciences, which indeed have a similar procedure. So they also have a nomination stage and they also have a voting stage, although it is a much less transparent thing than econometric society. But anyway, there is this two-stage thing. We are also going to look at the American Economic Association. This is slightly different because there is no voting here. It's always done by a committee. Okay, so in that sense, the mechanism can be different. And what we are going to be looking here is this is exactly the same result that I showed you for the econometric society. So in the old times, it was negative and significant, and in the most recent times, it is now positive and significant. Now, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and National Academy of Sciences have a similar pattern in that in the old times, it was negative, not significant. Indeed, for the National Academy of Science, before the 80s, no women was at all elected. Okay, so that's pretty significant. And then what we also find is that for the most recent period, again, this becomes positive and significant. And even before the last decade, even in the 2000s, there is already some signs that both the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences indeed were bringing in and appointing females so basically they had a higher likelihood of being elected than males. The American Economic Association is kind of the exception in the sense that we don't find any evidence that female scholars were neglected at any point in time. And we do see, however, that in the most recent period, there is also this preference for female appointees in that sense. So this is what we find. I'm not sure how I am doing with time, but let me just finish saying that what we are currently doing, especially inspired by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences, we did think that it is also interesting to go further and beyond economics. So basically saying, is this something going on in economics, or is this something also going on in other fields in which maybe the female representation is similar? So in that sense, we are going to look at math. In math, the female representation, you can see it here in green, is not that different among these AAAS and NAS fellows from econ, okay? And then another field that is quite different is psychology, in the sense that in psychology, the female representation has been much higher. So we want to see doing a similar exercise. So we are constructing this data set, equivalent data sets for psychology and for math, and we want to compare it to econ to see whether these patterns on the recognition of the peer recognition in science has been different for males and females, not only in econ, but also in other fields. And I think I'm gonna stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nekore. Very interesting work, and I think it's really an example of how the different institutional frameworks can affect the representation of women in the different disciplines. We need to move on because we're a little bit behind schedule. Our next speaker is Sarah Smith, who's going to talk about male and female voices in economics. So Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Almudena. I hope you can see my slides. So I'm going to talk about male and female voices in economics, as the title suggests. So we're well aware that women are underrepresented in economics. So Erin provided the figures for the UK, and the underrepresentation is not only in academia, but also in policy and also in industry. In this paper, we're focusing on a different aspect of underrepresentation, which is women's voices in economics debates and discussions. And we present evidence to suggest that women's voices are even more absent from economics debates than headline figures on underrepresentation would suggest. So in the paper, we analyze around 19,000 opinions expressed by around 100 leading academic economists. And we look at various aspects of voice in giving opinions. And the headline findings are that men are more willing to express an opinion. They're more likely to give an opinion and more likely to comment. And they're also more certain and confident in expressing their opinions. They're less likely to say they're uncertain. They're more likely to express strong agreement or disagreement. And they also have greater self-confidence in the opinions that they give. And we also show some evidence that male strong, confident opinions are more likely to be heard. So we're not the first to sort of think about gender differences in expressing opinions. There are previous studies in economics and psychology. What's novel about this study is documenting a gender gap among a group of people who are highly selected. So these are leading academic economists. They've also agreed to be on a panel in order to give their opinions. So they're expecting to be asked to give their opinions. And they're also very homogeneous. So they have very similar backgrounds in terms of their PhD institutions. They're also at a very similar set of institutions currently. These data have been looked at previously. So there was an AEA Papers and Proceedings by Heather Sarsons and her co-author. So we do several additional things. We've got some more diverse set of measures of voice. We do some further analysis of dynamics and by question type. And a big focus of the paper is on a discussion of real world implications. Just a caveat, so to say that the focus of this paper is not on why there are these gender differences, but really on the implications for both the profession and also for promoting diversity. So the data we use come from the Institute of Global Markets Economist Expert Survey. So as I said, it's a panel of around 100 leading academic economists, split pretty equally between US-based and European-based economists. 21% are women. As I said, they come from a relatively narrow range of current institutions, and also a narrow range in terms of the institutions where they got their PhD. So around 2/3 of these academic economists got their PhDs from the same 4 institutions. There's an example of the type of questions that they're asked on the right. So this is one of the recent ones. So it's asking what the economists think about a windfall tax on the profits of large oil companies. And the economists give a range of responses. So they can strongly agree, say they're uncertain, disagree, strongly agree, and also, so some don't answer or say they don't have an opinion or don't give an answer. You can see below there's some more detail. So the economists are also asked how confident they are in their answers. This is related to the degree of uncertainty, but you can have people sort of being uncertain with great confidence or strongly agreeing with less confidence. So there is some independent variation. The IGM weights the opinions by confidence. And you can see also that some economists leave an opinion here. Darren Asimoglu decided to give a little bit of background on this. Okay, so we have 5 different measures that we focus on, although, so we're thinking about volubility, which is how much the economists express opinions, both whether they give an opinion and whether they leave a comment. Also, we look at their certainty, so whether they report that they're uncertain on the issue or whether they strongly agree or disagree, and also these reported levels of self-confidence. And the main finding is that women tend to be less likely to give opinions, less confident, and less certain on all these indicators. So we have actually an additional one here, which is an earlier version of the paper, sorry about that. So you can see women are significantly less likely to give an opinion. They're more likely to be uncertain. We also were thinking about sort of standing out and voting against the consensus. So women are less likely to vote against the consensus. They're much less likely to give a strong opinion. They're much less likely to leave a comment, and they're less likely to, they have a lower level of confidence. So that's the kind of the main takeaway in terms of the empirical analysis. In the paper, we do a number of bits of further analysis. So I should sort of guide you to the notes under the figure. So this includes a number of controls. So we match in numbers of citations. We match in where they got their PhD, where they currently are. These are question fixed effects, and also whether they're sort of in the US sample or the European sample. So this is including some controls. In the paper, we then do some further analysis. So some of these fields are asked in on topics where the experts might feel they're kind of like that's kind of within their field. So so we kind of like wonder whether perhaps men are more likely to be confident outside their field of expertise compared to women, whereas actually when it comes to their field of expertise, women are just as confident, in which case these differences in confidence might not matter, because in real life economists would be typically asked to give their opinions in relation to topics that they're experts on. However, we find that there are gender gaps both inside and outside the fields of expertise. So expertise does increase volubility, confidence, and uncertainty, but you get gender gaps both on questions whether women are expert compared to where they're not expert compared to the men. In fact, women experts are sort of like men who are non-experts. That's a sort of degree of difference. We also thought about, there's a literature saying, that stereotypical behaviors can be important. So obviously every area of economics tends to be dominated by men, but there are some topics which are seen as more male and some which are less male. So in addition to the expertise, you also split by macrofinance international and public development and labor. But again, we find gender gaps irrespective of field. We look at the different types of questions. So some of the questions are about sort of core economic theory. Some are positive questions where they're empirically verifiable, at least in principle. Some questions require elements of judgment. So they're inherently normative questions where there's some value judgment at play. And we find these gender gaps are systematically across these different question types, again, suggesting that they're going to be meaningful for when economists are asked to give their opinions on policy relevant questions, which are likely to be sort of possibly normative, but also positive when they're asked to comment on the evidence. And also, many of these experts have been asked questions sort of for several years. We looked at whether the gender differences persisted over time, whether women became relatively more confident or men realized they were more confident, became less confident, but we found that the gender gaps persisted over time. Okay, so having established these differences in the paper, we sort of asked, so what does this matter? The key takeaway is, we should be thinking not only about representation in numbers, but also representation in voice. And if you think that these women are making up 21% of the panel members, they're making up 19% of the opinions, 14% of strong opinions, and 12% of comments. So the representation of women in economics is even less when you think about how vocal women are in terms of debates. And these are women who are, among the very leading academics, in the US and Europe. So we're not talking about, we're talking about women who are incredibly successful, and are sort of, and have been invited to give their opinion. So, the fact that you get these gender gaps among this group, I think, is quite telling. It may not matter if, strong, confident male opinions are not listened to. Is it the case that, that men speak loudly, but no one listens? In order to try and get some sense of that, what we did is took average confidence levels and average incidence of strong opinions for each of the panel members, and correlated them with the number of Twitter followers they have when they're on Twitter. So if you think of Twitter followers as being a sense of like, how much people are listening to to kind of like people's opinions, what you can see in this figure is that the more confident men are, the more Twitter followers they have. And the more they give strong opinions, the more Twitter followers they have. So confident men who express strong opinions tend to have more Twitter followers. So it's some indication that they are more influential in terms of debates. Interestingly, for women, you don't see that positive correlation. These are small numbers, but it's interesting that when looking at both dimensions, the relationship is different. So, louder and stronger male voices are more likely to be heard, but telling women to lean in and speak up may not increase their influence. And going back to, why women are less confident, it may be this sort of backlash phenomenon because, you know, women's confidence doesn't translate in the same way as men's does into influence. I don't want to read too much into this, but this evidence is speaking to the fact that you know, in practice, strong, confident male opinions are more likely to be listened to. We also think it has implications for the profession. You know, we know that economics is male dominated, and it means that the economics voice is a strong, confident male voice. So if we just did some thought experiments, and if you reverse the gender balance of the panel members, you get an increase in the number of questions where there's kind of no clear consensus, and it would reduce the number of questions where there's a consensus of strongly agree or disagree. So economic opinions would look different in a sort of, in the sense of the strength with which opinions are expressed if it were a more female dominated profession, or if it were a less male dominated profession. I think it's hard to say whether this is unambiguously good or bad. So there's this nice quote from a JEP paper that confidence is perhaps the greatest achievement of the economics profession, but it is also its most vulnerable trait and its Achilles heel. Decision makers and politicians welcome strong opinions, and it may explain why economists are quite influential in policy making. But strong opinions may be wrong and may mask underlying policy uncertainty. And in the paper, we show some evidence that women are more sensitive to background uncertainty than men. Women are more likely to be uncertain when other panel members are uncertain. So they're calibrating more to background uncertainty. So men may be expressing opinions when there's more background, strongly and confidently when there's more background uncertainty. So finally, there's an obvious takeaway is that when we're talking about promoting diversity, it's important not only that diverse voices are represented, but that they're heard. So it's not enough to increase representation. It has to be the case that we promote inclusivity and allow all voices to be heard. So we did another thought experiment and kind of wondered, you know, suppose in an economics debate, the voice that is heard is the one expressing a strong opinion. And in a tie, if both a man and a woman express a strong opinion, it's the one that is the most confident. In this thought experiment, if you sort of randomly take one man and one woman from the panel on each question, you know, who would win, which voice would be heard across the 400 questions. So by construction, we've created equal gender representation because we're sampling one man and woman randomly and sort of seeing whose voice is loudest or strongest in this conversation. And women would only kind of be heard 43% of the time. So, you know, unless we're promoting diversity, promoting diverse voices being heard, this kind of the difference in the nature of the voices and the way opinions are expressed might still lead women to be underrepresented in debates. So in terms of practical takeaways, we'd like to recommend that the IIGM should really stop weighting panelists' opinions by their confidence, because it's giving excessive weight to male opinions. And also, you know, it really highlights the importance of policies and practices to promote inclusive environments. So, you know, the guidelines for constructive seminars and guidelines for inclusive meetings are really of fundamental importance when you think about the implications of these differences in voice for the way economics debates and discussions are going to take place. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. You end up there with some recommendations that are really important. Again, another example of how the institutional framework and how we set the rules of the game matter for gender representation. And also you point out to other dimensions as well. So, okay, we have some time. We're running 5 minutes late, but we'll take it from the Q&A session. So Shelly Lambert is our next speaker. And I think you're ready, Shelly. So I pass it on to you. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks very much, El Medina. I imagine, yes, you can see my screen. I can see that. So I think I might help us catch up a little bit. I don't think I'm going to be too long. I wanted to start out by augmenting what the data that Erin presented with just an update on the situation in the United States. This is from the last report of the AEA's Committee on the Status of Women. And the thing I'd like to highlight here, the bottom line is full professors, the next one up are tenured associates, and the line in gray is assistant professors in PhD granting departments. And the big news here was that although during the period that I was chair of CSWEP, that number was completely stagnant, hadn't moved for quite a few years. In the last 3 years, there's been a tick upward in the female representation among assistant professors. However, there's another aspect to that, which is if we focus in on the top 20 departments, and remember that economics is an intensely hierarchical discipline, and these are the future journal editors, the tenure letter writers, the gatekeepers to the profession in the future, there's been no change in the representation of assistant professors. So this might be a little bit hard to see, but women were 24.5% of assistant professors in the top 20 departments during the period 2003 to 2007. They're now 22.7%. So the apparent progress at all PhD granting institutions, and there's more than 100 of them, has not been reflected in either the top 20 departments, or you can see it even more clearly in the top 10 departments, but that's pretty noisy data because we've got small numbers here. So it's not quite as encouraging as we thought. So what I want to focus on here are two things. One is we now have a fairly substantial body of really rigorous, convincing empirical research that shows that there is biased treatment of women in the economics profession. And the last three speakers have added some really interesting aspects to that body of evidence. And what I want to do is sort of summarize a little bit about what we now know about gender barriers in economics, and then make a brief point at the end. This isn't getting through to the profession as a whole. All right, so this is not generally understood by economists. The first thing is we know there's a leaky pipeline at tenure. A lot of these studies have focused on the United States because anyone who has had some contact with the academic profession in the US knows that the tenure barrier is an extremely substantial one. And moving from assistant professor to tenured associate is really an essential and difficult stage in an academic's career in the US. And this is one of the early studies on gender in economics by Ginter and Kahn showed that 10 years after getting the PhD, female economists were 21 percentage points less likely than men to have a tenured academic job. They had some few measures of productivity, numbers of publications and so on, but most of that difference was not explained by any measure of productivity. And more recent studies have really backed this up. And one of the interesting aspects of this is that there has been a lot of progress in tenuring women in other fields, and including math-intensive fields that has not been shared by economics. So economics, as a recent study by Ginter and Kahn points out, is the one field where gender differences in tenure receipt seem to remain even after background and productivity controls are factored in, and even for single childless women. All right, so there's a sort of a general folk opinion out there that the problems that women have in economics are tied to either babies or math. It's not babies and it's not math. Right, and we now can be pretty confident about that. There's a lot of sort of more specific studies that probably a lot of you are familiar with that shows that there's been gender bias in the evaluation of scholarship. There's Heather Sarson's piece on co-authored work and tenure decisions. A recent study on women are less likely to have their submissions to competitive conferences accepted even after an amazing number of controls for productivity and future success of the paper that is submitted. And the truly horrifying study about the adoption of gender-neutral parental tenure clock extensions in the US that showed that the main result of those policies was to benefit men in the acquisition of tenure at the expense of women. There's evaluation in the bias in the evaluation of teaching, and differential treatment in publishing. So there's Erin's forthcoming paper on papers written by women taking longer to review at top journals. Other evidence that there is higher editorial standards for papers written by women. And the previous manifestation of the Card, Della Vigna, Funk, and Iraberry team showing that their top journals in economics appear to hold women to higher standards in acceptance if we are judging quality by the citations that the paper receives later. Part of what's behind this, but not all of it, is that there are gender-driven productivity differences, right? Women do publish less than men. However, we also know, although there's tremendous amount of evidence on this academia-wide, there's less sort of specific info on econ here, that women are expected to spend more time teaching and mentoring. We can see because intensive mentoring programs such as CSWEP's cement policy does have an effect on increasing the success of women scholars, that there's almost certainly a lack of mentoring in the profession more broadly. Women have distinct collaboration patterns. They have fewer co-authors. There's sort of higher clustering of groups of co-authors. And these are patterns that also have been shown to be correlated with lower levels of academic productivity. And let me just note, you can find short versions of many of these studies in the CPR ebook that I edited not very long ago. So there's some pretty sticky remaining questions also that we don't have very much evidence on. What is the gendered impact of the acknowledged rather aggressive and adversarial culture in economics? Sort of the first study on the treatment of men and women in economics seminars has come out, and it shows that the audience treats female speakers differently. They are more aggressive, they interrupt more, and so on. And there's the question of how important gender harassment is, or sexual harassment. We know that it is generally very pervasive in academia. There have been studies done by that, about that, a recent National Academy of Sciences study, for example, but we don't have gender economic specific evidence on harassment per se. One of the consequences of this is that there is an enormous difference in satisfaction, job satisfaction, between male and female academics in economics. So economics is the cluster that is third from the left here. The blue bars are male satisfaction, the number of men who report that they are very or somewhat satisfied with their work. In 1997 and 2010, the red bars are women, and you can see that job satisfaction among female economists is both low relative to other fields and tremendously low compared to male economists. There's some updates to be done here on the impact of the COVID-19 emergency and the productivity of academic women, particularly academic women with young children whose childcare responsibilities have been and probably still are in many cases upended by the epidemic. There's 3 economists who are tracking this at the moment. They found very early in the pandemic that there appeared to be a differential drop in working paper submissions among female economists. They've got a survey ongoing to try to flesh this out a little bit more. So is the profession as a whole aware of the fact that there is pervasive evidence of either discrimination against women, or, if you don't want to use that term, biased treatment? A 2008 survey of AEA members found no, men are not aware of this at all. 76% of female AEA members believe that opportunities for economics faculty in the US favor men. Fewer than 20% of men shared that view. And in fact, a very substantial minority of men felt that opportunities in economics favor women. Usually at this point of this talk, I talk about the good stuff, how clearly attitudes in many economics associations are shifting, There's new work on what kinds of characteristics of graduate programs lead to better outcomes for women, but I don't feel like doing that today. So instead, let me tell you a brief anecdote that I think unfortunately is kind of characteristic. I recently had a very lengthy Zoom conversation with a senior economist. And he requested this conversation as a follow-up to a statement that I made regarding the stuff I've just been talking about, that there's solid evidence that women are disadvantaged in economics. And his first statement to me in this conversation was, "You have a messaging problem." To which I responded, "I have a what?" He says, "You have a messaging problem because all these studies are inconsistent with the personal history, the personal experience of male academics. For example, I was once on a hiring committee that made really serious attempts to hire a woman candidate. And I said, that's a data point. I'm talking about a substantial body of peer-reviewed research here." And he continued to argue with me for a long time, at some point waving hands and saying, well, you can prove anything in one of these empirical studies. He appeared to be impervious to reasoned debate. And unfortunately, I don't have any particular reason to think that he is a major outlier. At one point, I even said, I can't even imagine my telling you in some area that's related to your area of expertise that I have some personal anecdote that is inconsistent with you, and therefore I don't believe you. I said, and that's what you're doing with me right now. So what does it matter? Well, look, we now have extremely solid empirical evidence that there is biased treatment. What are the consequences of that? Bayer and Rouse have a very nice piece sort of summarizing the benefits, the scientific benefits to diversity in an academic field. I think that there's another thing going on here very clearly, and this is something that I've outlined in a recent working paper on how has gender economics gone wrong. And I think that there are several habits of thought that are characteristic of economists that really limit our conceptual framework on a lot of topics, but particularly anything that has to do with gender. And one of those is economists have extraordinarily strong priors that make them resistant to both evidence and to new approaches on a lot of topics. And in the case of gender, I think there's two pieces to it. One is something we're all very familiar with, market bias. All right, even if we're well aware that there are situations in which markets don't work very well, we still believe that markets are right? And if female workers earn less than male workers, it's either that they're less productive or that they want easy jobs that pay less. But there's also another source of bias here that I think is operational, and that is gender essentialism. There is, it seems to me, in 40 years of talking about gender to economists, a real deep psychological need to believe that women are fundamentally different from men, and that most of the gender gaps that we see out there are due to this fact that women are different. What they want is different, what they can do is different from men, and so on. And I now believe that this goes very deep, and it is erecting barriers to the ability of the profession more broadly to see effectively the kinds of conclusions that studies such as those we've seen in this session have to say, to the evidence that they provide and the conclusions that we need to draw from. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Shelly. I remember a long time ago when I was a PhD student and I presented, and you were my referee at the conference, and you said, what a thought-provoking paper. And I think your presentation continues to be thought-provoking now as well. So thank you very much for ending with that with that note, and I want to pick up on that latest point that you made about gender essentialism, and how that speaks to what some of the findings that Sarah presented, because it's that female economists do communicate in different ways and react differently to men. We don't know whether that is because they are different or whether the returns are different if they communicate in the same way. What are your thoughts about that?
I think that both of those are operational. I think there's now a lot of evidence that this is the case. You know, if you grow up female in most societies, you are taught to behave differently. You know, I look at the studies of women are less likely to choose a competitive environment. And I'm thinking, I can definitely remember being told that being competitive was not an appropriate form of behavior for a young woman. We're trained differently, we're socialized differently, even in households, I think, that see themselves as relatively gender neutral. But I think there's also a tremendous amount of evidence that women are punished, are penalized for being assertive, expressing confident opinions about topics, whether they know the answer or not. And I think that there's good reason to believe that that is also true in economics as well as in other fields.
Thank you, Shelly. Sarah, is there anything, because I pointed to your paper in particular, so is there anything that you want to add?
And so no, not particularly. I mean, as I said, we're not commenting on why. I mean, I think the kind of, you know, I would sometimes when you sort of try something, you don't really know what the results will be like. But I did think the findings from Twitter were quite interesting, and that sort of speaks to the fact that it's that the response to men and women behaving confidently is quite different. So yeah, no, I think it's just to add my thanks to Shelly for a very useful, if stimulating, if quite depressing sort of note to end on.
Sorry about that. I usually try to end on a high note, and I just don't.
It's got to be said.
Okay, so there were some questions actually from the audience on Alessandra's presentation. So one question says, I think I missed that. Do you find that female candidates with mixed gender referees get more positive letters from female referees? And I think there was another question from Nagori to Alessandra's about the field. I don't know, Nagori, whether you want to follow that up.
My only point was that ideally we like to have random combinations, right? So in some sense, given men and women, we still work in slightly different fields. This assortative matching between the gender of the applicant or the candidate and the gender of the advisor or the referee letters might be indeed determined quite a lot by the topic that they choose.
Okay, so thank you for both questions. I try to say a few words about both. So on Nagori's point, yeah, I mean, in the descriptive, I mentioned that indeed it is more likely that women have a female advisor, and indeed we don't have a random match in between. But in the regression part, I mean, we haven't yet used, say, gendered matching in terms of advisor and candidates as, say, outcomes, but when we look at the career success, the measure that I used before, we are controlling for Journal of Economic Literature or field of research fixed effect. So that's what we are currently doing, which is not exactly, let's say, what you were perhaps pointing at, but it is, let's say, even within a given field, I still see that there is a difference in terms of career success. And I find that these, the letter tone, the letter length, and the advisor characteristics and the candidate characteristics matter, let's say, in explaining the raw gender gap. Regarding the question from, let's say, the audience, I mean, we are not really, we do not classify the letter tone as positive or negative. So what we are trying to understand is whether female and male candidates are described using more, say, standout, grindstone, communal, or agentic words. And somehow, I mean, all of them could be considered as positive. I mean, if you say a person is hardworking, you're not saying something bad about him or her. The point is that some of these words, say the grindstone, we find that they negatively affect career outcomes, whereas standout words positively affect career outcomes. So, I mean, this would be the first thing I would answer. Did I answer everything the person in the audience asked, or was there anything else?
I think you did, Alessandra, and
Okay.
Following up on that, and given what some of the findings, again, from Sarah on Twitter, and what Shelly was talking about, you know, the different returns to lean in. I was wondering when I saw your regression results, whether those indicators that you have for the letter content, some of them have a positive impact, others have a negative impact on future career. Whether you've actually looked at whether the effect of those of what that content is, I guess, capturing, whether there is a differential effect by gender. So whether talking about your personal life is negative, whether it is a woman's letter or a man's letter.
Okay, so you would like to see, the interaction between grindstone and female?
Yes, I
or...
guess that's what I'm talking about.
Okay, okay.
More, you know, because thinking about what's the implication, right, from your results.
Okay. No, I don't think we have tried that, but I think it's something which could be done. Yes. Yes.
Because right now, given the results that you have, what would be the recommendation for the profession?
Well, I mean, I think that our first goal was just to show that, I mean, people talk about different things when they write these letters, and somehow what they talk about has an impact on these career prospects. So somehow it's just raising awareness on this. I don't have now, let's say, ready, or I mean, this is something we are trying to think about. I mean, what would be our let's say, indication, whether it would be good, for instance, not to, let's say, what we were wondering is, would it be better to have some some forms which you just have to put cross in, rather than letting people write whatever they want to write? So this would be extreme, right? But maybe we need something in between, making people more aware that they are conveying somehow some implicit biases, which then have an impact, or go all the other way, where you just prevent people from writing extensively about candidates. I don't have, let's say, a clear answer on this, and I would be happy also to hear what you think about, what you all think in terms of the implications of what we are finding. We haven't yet, let's say, identified the clear policy implication of how we would like to change the refereeing process. We want to keep it because it's informative, but we need to be aware that the type of information that it conveys somehow may be detrimental for someone. And we know that women are talked about in terms of grindstone words more often than men are. So that's the issue.
I think it would be helpful, because one of the reasons why women serve a lot on committees is because they're seen as having less implicit bias. But I think some of the studies show that isn't the case. So I think it's useful to kind of see whether this implicit bias is common for both women and male letter writers. So.
But what we found is that actually, I mean, women tend to concentrate more on all these, I mean, use more of all these words, but they do not do it differently. Okay, so what we found is that it is not the case that they use these words more for female candidates rather than for male candidates. So they just use them more. But then when it comes to distinguishing between male and female referees, we see that it is male referees who use these words differently for male and female candidates. So in that sense, we were concluding that the gendered language comes more from male referees rather than from female referees.
I think we are 1 minute above schedule. So I think I don't want to leave without thanking all of you for participating in this session and presenting your interesting, sometimes a bit depressing, but I think it gives us a lot of food for thought and to continue to work on gender equality within the profession. And with that note, I think we need to stop here, but let's keep in touch and let's keep united in this effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.